part 2 of our section on Buddhism. Today we're going to learn more about the Buddhist concept of nirvana and how it differs from the concept of enlightenment. We're going to talk about karma, the Buddhist understanding of karma, and also merit. We're going to talk about anitya, the concept of impermanence and what that means to Buddhist philosophy. We're also going to talk about the Sangha, which is the Buddhist community, the Buddhist monastic community, which includes all of the monks and the nuns and the monasteries. So first, let's talk about nirvana. You see in the corner here we have a little picture of Buddha. They call him the sleeping Buddha. Whenever there's an image of Buddha lying down like that, he's called the sleeping Buddha. But in fact, it's the Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, on his deathbed. And the moment when he reaches pure nirvana. So, what is nirvana? Nirvana literally means extinguishing, like you extinguish a flame. Sometimes it will be translated as extinction. It's better understood as liberation from mental affliction, suffering, and rebirth. So when a Buddhist spends many years meditating and studying, he or she can reach nirvana, which is a peace of mind, a liberation from suffering. This is different than enlightenment. The Buddha found enlightenment. Any Buddha is someone who has found enlightenment. Enlightenment is the wisdom, the understanding of the universe that can come with nirvana, but doesn't always come with nirvana. So somebody can find nirvana in this life without finding enlightenment. Okay? So there's a distinction. Nirvana is liberation from suffering. Enlightenment is this great universal wisdom of the nature of the universe and of the self. Okay? So in Buddhism, people will refer to arhanis, who are people who have found nirvana, living people who have found nirvana. There's this idea that when the arhani dies, their individuality just completely disappears, and they enter the highest state of nirvana, which is kind of this, which is not really spoken of a lot, but seems to be a sort of like oneness with the source. You might be able to call it that. Though that's kind of a Hindu understanding of things, but there's this idea that if you find nirvana in this life, when you die, it's when the Buddha is here on his deathbed, you enter the highest state of nirvana. Why is it the highest state? It's just because you've left this world of illusion and suffering. You can't completely rid yourself of suffering until you leave this world. But you can find a state of mind where you're no longer attached to the world and you're no longer suffering from desire and loss. Does that make sense? So you find detachment from the world, which leads to nirvana, but then when you die, you completely leave this world and you get the highest state of nirvana. Okay. And of course, Buddhists believe that the way to find nirvana is the Eightfold Path. And we're going to learn that in certain sects and certain denominations of Buddhism, Buddhists are encouraged to try and seek enlightenment, not just nirvana, but enlightenment. And other groups believe that enlightenment is something that's very, very difficult to find and not necessary. It's more just important that you find nirvana, whether or not you find enlightenment. And we'll start to talk about that in the next lesson. Okay? So I want to make clear what nirvana means, the two stages of nirvana, and also of enlightenment as being something that's different than nirvana. So this idea of extinguishing or extinction. Here's a quote from the Buddha. It says, "Being religious and following dharma has nothing to do with dogma." Dogma means beliefs and teachings. Has nothing to do with dogma that the world is eternal. For whether the world is eternal or otherwise, birth, old age, death, sorrow, pain, misery, grief, and despair exist. I am concerned with the extinction of these. And here the translation extinction means nirvana. So this is really fundamental to understanding Buddhist philosophy and theology. And that is that the main goal of Buddhism is to extinguish, the pain and grief caused by life. And Buddha says whether the world is eternal or not, so whether or not this world lasts forever, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the world was, for example, modern Buddhists would say it doesn't matter if the world was created by a god or if it was created by science. These things don't matter. These sorts of big picture questions don't matter to Buddhists. All that matters is that you try to slowly eliminate your karma, build up merit, and work your way towards nirvana or enlightenment, depending upon which group of Buddhists you come from. So why is that? Why is that not important? Let's take a look at some of the things that Buddhism is not interested in. Some questions that Buddhism doesn't really address. Number one, Buddhists don't really address the idea of a soul. They don't address the idea of life after death. There's an idea of reincarnation. Buddhism itself isn't so interested in whether or not there's like heaven and hell and those kinds of things. We're actually going to see in the next lesson and the lesson after that there are major exceptions to this rule. There are some Buddhists who address the question of life after death, but the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni Buddha, was not interested in addressing this question. Buddhists are not interested in addressing the origin of the universe. They're not interested in addressing the idea of whether or not they're God or gods, right? They're non-theistic. From a Buddhist point of view, for example, the Dalai Lama, who's a great Tibetan Buddhist leader, has said, there may be a God, there might not be a God, but it's not important to them. All that's important is addressing the issue of grief and finding nirvana and enlightenment to extinguish that grief. Let's return to this idea of the soul. Now, this is a really complicated concept, but Buddhists don't believe in that people have a fixed soul. They don't believe that there's a fixed sense of self. What do I mean by that? In many religious traditions, there's this idea that you have a soul, and that your soul is kind of your essence. Your soul is who you are, and no matter what happens to your body, no matter what happens in this life, your soul remains intact. That's who you are. That's essentially who you are. In Hinduism, the self, which is the Atman, you recognize the word Atman here, right? It's a part of Brahman, and we'll eventually return to that. Buddhists don't look at it like that. They believe in an anatman. The word an means no or not, the not soul. Buddhists believe in the not soul. Why is that? It goes back to the idea of anitya, the idea of impermanence. Everything in this world is constantly changing and will constantly, and everything in the world will eventually go away, will pass away. And so how can there be a fixed self if everything's changing? You're changing, right? And if you believe in reincarnation, you change from lifetime to lifetime. But even from moment to moment, you are changing. So how can there be a fixed self if your thoughts, your feelings, your place in the world, the character of person that you are constantly changing? How can there be a fixed self? Let me put it to you like this. There's an image here of an acorn, right? Here the acorn's in the ground, and it starts to, sprout and starts to grow roots and starts to grow up, right? Can you say the acorn is the same thing as the tree that it grows into? This is a major question for Buddhism. And the answer for Buddhists is no. No, it changes. And therefore, there's no fixed, set self. You're like the acorn. You're changing. and what you will change into, can't be known, but it's not going to be the you that you are now. So for Buddhists, there's an anatman, there's a not-self. Now, does that mean that there's no soul? I mean, clearly if we're reincarnated, there's something that's being passed along, right? Well, the Buddha answered a question about what that is, what that something is that gets passed around from incarnation to incarnation, with the parable of the leaves. It's a story that the Buddha was surrounded by his students when a man came up to him. He was in the forest, and the man said to him, master or teacher, is there an Atman? Is there a soul? And the Buddha didn't say anything. So the man said, well, is there not a soul? And the Buddha didn't say anything. So the man was discouraged and he walked off. He didn't know what to do, so he left. So the Buddha's students said to him, well, why didn't you answer his question? Is there a soul? And the Buddha said, if I told him that there is an Atman, or there is a soul, he would have become attached to this idea of himself not changing. And that would have hurt his journey towards nirvana and enlightenment. He would have become attached to the idea of himself. I told him that there was no soul, then he would have thought, that nothing really mattered. He might have kind of become a nihilist, someone who believes in nothing. And the Buddha picked up a handful of leaves from the forest floor and ground, and he said, are there more leaves in my hand or in the forest? And his students said, well, there are more leaves in the forest, obviously. And the Buddha said, all of my lessons are like the leaves of the forest, but I only have a limited amount of time with you. So I only have time for the most important lessons, what's in my hand, the leaves in my hand. That's all I can give you. So from the Buddha's perspective, these questions about whether or not there's a soul, if that's not going to help you find nirvana or find enlightenment, then it's not important that he leave those lessons, or that he explain to people how that works. That's the way Buddhism looks at it. If it's not going to help you reach nirvana or enlightenment, then it might not be covered in the texts. So it's a very practical. It's a very practical point of view, but it leaves a lot of questions, right, for people studying Buddhism. And these are just some of the questions it leaves right here. So that is anatman, and we're going to return to this idea again. So keep that in mind. So how does Buddhism differ from Hinduism? Because clearly there are a good number of similarities, because Buddhism is an offshoot of Hinduism. Well, Buddhism rejects the authority of the ancient Vedic texts, those Vedas that we studied at the beginning of the class, the caste system, the deities, Vedic worship, all of that Buddhism rejects. It rejects the concept of Brahman, the great overarching God. Buddhism does not believe in that. The concept of Atman, Buddhism does not believe in that neither. Buddhism does not follow the practice of strict asceticism. When we looked at pictures of the Shaivites who covered their bodies in ashes and let their hair grow long, they reject the practice of strict asceticism and withdrawal from the world, living out in the middle of nowhere. Rather, they believe in the middle path, right? Being somewhat connected to the world, but not being so involved in the world that you become attached to it. Concept of attachment and detachment is very, very important. Finally, and this is probably a minor point, but an interesting point, Buddhists are not required to all be vegetarians. Buddhists would say it's better to be a vegetarian. We don't have to be a vegetarian. Only people, and generally Buddhists who are vegetarian tend to be, I guess, a little bit more on the religious side of things, right? Some years ago, I was studying Buddhism in Asia, And I was in Mongolia, actually, which, as you may know, has very long, very, very cold winters. Winters that make our Champaign, Illinois winters look, kind of weak in comparison. And there was a girl I met who was translating for the Buddhist monks that we were talking to. And she was maybe 16, 17. And her English was quite good. And she told us that she was a devout Buddhist, and she tried being a vegetarian. But when winter came, she got cold and she got sick. In Mongolia, it's the winters are so harsh. You need to eat meat to keep to put a little bit more fat on your body for the extra calories, the extra protein, to stay warm. And so she talked to a monk or an abbot about it, and he told her, well, then eat meat. Don't hurt yourself, right? Take the middle path. You can still be a good person. You can still do good deeds without being a vegetarian. So that's kind of give you an idea of the way Buddhists look at things. So karma and merit. You've heard me use this term a couple times. As in Hinduism, let me re-emphasize again that in Hinduism and Buddhism both, karma is bad. Karma is always bad. Even if your karma means you're going to get good things in this world, it's still bad. Let me put it to you this way. Let's say you do good deeds, and because you do good deeds, you get your karma brings you material rewards, right? Those material rewards are still holding you down, shackling you to this world, as opposed to, releasing you and allowing you to be liberated. So even if you're reaping good things from your karma, it's still shackling you to this world. It's still bad. A golden chain that ties you to the world of illusion is still a chain. So karma's always bad, really. So Buddhism has this concept of merit. And there's this idea in Hinduism as well, but Buddhism does something interesting with it. Merit is something that can kind of count against your karma, right? So you're trying to kind of work off your karma. Think of it that way. Merit helps you work off your karma. So just like in Hinduism, karma is about the law of cause and effect, like dominoes. And merit helps erase this karma. So how do you get merit? You get merit by following the Eightfold Path, right? Right thoughts, right intentions, right actions, which follow from right thoughts. You can't do something good for selfish reasons. That doesn't count. If you do something good, if you're helping someone, you have to help someone for the sake of helping them. If you're helping someone to make yourself look good, that doesn't count. In Buddhism, your intention and your understanding needs to be right before your actions can be right. So if you follow the Eightfold Path and you perform right actions because of right intentions, then you start building up merit. Okay, and that means and those actions can be helping people. It can be religious devotion, like meditating and studying. It can be showing reverence for the various the Buddha and Bodhisattva. It could be entering monastic life. We're going to talk about monastic life, the monks and nuns, in a second. But a lot of Buddhists, especially in Asia, will enter monastic life just for a short time, just for a few years even. Giving alms, supporting the monastic community by giving food and money, that's another way of building merit. And for the religious community, for the monasteries, in some places, I won't say in all places, but in some Buddhist monasteries, there's this idea that the merit that they're building up by living a monastic life and trying to follow the Eightfold Path can be shared, right? So most communities will have a temple or a monastery nearby, and people will come and they'll have ceremonies. And there's this idea that monks and nuns can kind of share, can kind of spread that merit out. Kind of like sharing a flame. Like if you have a candle and you light someone else's candle, right? And by doing so, you don't reduce your own flame, you just create a new one. So there's this idea you can spread merit like that, like spreading a flame. So let's talk a little bit more about the Sangha. Sangha is the monastic order. That's a very important part of Buddhist society. Buddhists don't have priests or pastors or things like that. They do have monks and nuns who are called bhikshus and bhikshunis. And at the head of every monastery, there's an abbot or an abbess. And Buddhists can enter monastic life pretty much any time. Actually, traditionally, you'll notice here that there are a lot of children here studying with this monk. It was very common in many Buddhist countries for people to send their sons into the monasteries when they were children so that they could get educations. Because the monks would teach them how to read, monks would teach them basic arithmetic, basic things like that a poor family would not be able to offer their sons otherwise. And even today, when I was studying Buddhism in Asia, I saw small children in Mongolia, a lot of small children who were living in the monastery who were, they had their heads shaved and they were in the robes. And it was because, their parents were living a nomadic life. They had, in Mongolia, people still often have herds of animals. The land there is not good for farming, but it is good for raising animals. It's not uncommon for people, there's still to be nomads who travel with their herds of animals around the country and live that way. But it's a very difficult way to live. And for a lot of parents, they want their children to get an education. So the children end up growing up in the monasteries. And the parents aren't trying to abandon them. Quite the contrary, they want them to have better opportunities. And usually then, I met another monk in Laos who was just about to turn 18, and when he turned 18, he would become an adult, and then he would have the choice to leave the monastery if he wanted to, or he could stay in either way, but he'd been there for many years. It's on the other side of Asia. Also, sometimes parents, in some places, children will enter monastery right about as they're growing up. I apologize. Okay. Right about the time when they're almost an adult, when they're about 13, 14 years old, children will go into a monastery for 2 or 3 years. And when they come out, they're then considered to be adults, and they can get married, and they can, take up a profession and those kinds of things. So the 2 or 3 years in a monastery, in some places, is like a rite of passage. And in places like Thailand, where it was very, very common for even girls also to join the monasteries for a short amount of time. Even today, like in school, they'll have like a monk-nun appreciation day where the kids will get to dress up and do the things that monks and nuns do. I've seen that. I don't know if that's in public schools or only in private schools, but I've seen that done. So the monastery is a very large organization that many people, take part in. It's not like here in the West where you don't often hear about monasteries. You could go your whole life without meeting a monk or a nun, especially in America. It's not very common, but there it's very common. It's a very important part of Buddhist society. And members of the Sangha are greatly revered. The monks that I talked to, I could only talk to within the confines of the monasteries. And at sunset, women had to leave. But it was, generally speaking, monks were expected not to talk to women, and nuns were expected not to talk to men. Not because they don't trust the monks and nuns, but because they're trying to, because the community around them is trying to show them respect. They're greatly revered. And if you're not in a monastery, if you're not a monk or a nun, you're a lay person, and lay people also take part in religious activities in monasteries and temples as well. So this right here, these are members of an organization called the Cambodian AIDS Project. It's Cambodian. It exists in Cambodia, obviously, and it was begun by Buddhist monks. You can see this man here. He looks like he might be an abbot, maybe, or he might be a former monk. And then there are many lay people as well. And there are a good number of charities in Asia that are started by Buddhists, monks and nuns of all kinds. AIDS foundations, foundations to eradicate poverty, social justice organizations, all sorts of different organizations that Buddhists start. This man right here is called. He's not the Sangha Raja. He's the deputy Sangha Raja. Sangha, as we've just learned, is the monasteries. Raja means like the leader. So he's one of the head leaders of the monastic community in Sri Lanka, in this case. Was it Sri Lanka or was it Bangladesh? It might have been Bangladesh. I'm sorry, I'm mixing my photos now. But he's a very important figure in the Sangha in his country. You can see he's being shown great reverence by the monks who are visiting with him. Here is a monk and a bunch of little boys. And this is actually, these are Tibetan monks. We're going to learn the difference between monks. You can tell the difference between denominations or sects of monks by the color of their robes. We'll learn that later. But these are Tibetan, and they're actually studying science in this class. So monks and nuns are also well revered for their training in logic and argument. It's one thing that monks learn in monasteries is how to work through complex philosophical problems and questions. And they have a lot of classes on those. Now this slide, I almost consider not including this slide, but I think it's very interesting. This is a tanka. It's Tibetan, right? Tibet, of course, it's a small country that is now a province of China that is currently trying to fight for its independence from China. But they have a really interesting, rich, and somewhat unusual tradition of Buddhism there. And they've taken, you recognize this? It's like it's the Dharma wheel, right? There are spokes, you can see 8 spokes, but it's complicated further, right? They've taken what is a very simple idea, the Dharma wheel, and they've added in this concept of the universe, right? And the concept of different realms. I mentioned that Buddhists don't believe in gods, and yet as Buddhism moved to different countries, some people came to believe that all these different gods of their local traditions still exist. They're in a different realm, and they're just like us, and that they're also trying to reach nirvana or enlightenment. So there are some. So I kind of included this picture because I know this week we're kind of studying kind of the bare bones of Buddhism, and it makes Buddhism seem like it's very simple and very straightforward. But once you look at the diversity of Buddhism across Asia, from Tibet to China to Sri Lanka to Thailand, Indonesia, Japan and Korea, it becomes there's just this great diversity of Buddhism, and some schools of Buddhism are more complicated than others. In Tibet, they have this idea that if you, for example, if you have horrible karma, there is a place. There's a place of that's like hell, and it's not permanent. You won't stay there forever, but you stay there long enough to work off certain karma if you've done horrible things. There's also this idea that there's an Ashura realm. I'm sorry, the Deva realm, where the gods live, right? And that's a good place to be, but because it's free from a lot of suffering. But the problem with gods is that they're so free of suffering that they forget that their goal is still to reach nirvana, right? So from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view, the best way to be is a human. You're not suffering horribly, but you don't have it so good that you forget that you're stuck in the realm of illusion, and you need to break out. And it's Yama, the Lord of Death, who turns the wheel, right? And these are both. They're both. Yama is a traditional Tibetan god. So you see, like they Tibetans fit their traditional beliefs in with Buddhism. So we'll talk more about Tibetan Buddhism next week. But I want to just let you know that there's a great diversity of Buddhism, as I said, and that different Buddhist societies may or may not incorporate other traditional religious ideas and values into Buddhism. And it actually gets to be pretty interesting once we'll have a chance to compare those. So the discussion for this lecture is, according to Buddhism, why is there no fixed self or soul? Keep in mind, when I say fixed, I mean unchanging, like set. Something's fixed. It's like nailed down and it can't move, it can't change. Buddhism, why is there no fixed self or soul? It's important that we go over this concept again because it's going to come up later on in the lectures. Okay? So let me know if you have any questions about any of this.